All right, English teacher friends and poetry lovers. So, in this particular writing workshop, we're going to celebrate National Hispanic Heritage Month with a poetry writing workshop, and I'm going to feature a couple of poems by Martin Espada and Jimmy Santiago Baca. So this will run very similar to other writing workshops that I've created in my YouTube channel, in which you've seen me Bob Ross my instruction. And what I mean by that is I will explicitly paint along with students and teachers through the creation of the introductory paragraph and then the body paragraph. So we'll tackle the introductory paragraphs using the inverted thesis. And as always, we'll do syllogistic body paragraphs. So National Hispanic Heritage Month begins September 15th and runs through October 15th. So hopefully you can use this with your classrooms and do a deep dive into poetry. So just in terms of context, to minimize the mimicry that often happens when teachers position themselves as expert writers in the classroom. Given that I'm going to feature Martin Espada's poem, Jorge the Janitor Finally Quits, and Jimmy Santiago Baca's poem, Who Understands Me But Me, my students cannot write about these poems. Otherwise, it just becomes an exercise in copycatism. So in the packet, there's 10 other poems, Hispanic writers, wide variety, and they can choose from those 10, but these particular two poems are off limits. And again, you guys can put together your own packets, or if you like mine, go ahead and use it. So let's begin. So as always, my one little caveat to teachers is this. I really think it's pivotal and crucial in terms of demystifying the act of writing for our students when teachers position themselves as the expert writer in the classroom. Get up to the proverbial canvas and easel and paint with your students. And here's what I mean by that. So you could say, all right, guys, we're going to, do some poetry today. We're going to do a poetry analysis. And as we know, you can declare or invert your thesis. But since we're doing literary analysis, we're going to invert the thesis. Here's 3 examples. 1, 2, 3. Show them, talk them through it. And it just really sort of illuminates the process and makes it less convoluted and less of a guesswork scenario when they are explicitly shown how to do things. So that's the beauty of templates, and that's the beauty of modeling. So the first question we need to ask ourselves is this: how do I write the introduction paragraph? And as I've already alluded to, since we're doing literary analysis, we are going to invert. So if you're familiar with my work, you know that for rhetorical analysis, we always declare. And there's tons of rhetorical analysis videos in my YouTube channel, so you can backtrack and see how that works. But for FRQ1, FRQ2, FRQ3 for the AP Lit exam, and even Gen Ed literature courses, we always invert. So it really simplifies things for us. Here's the kicker, though. In every prompt, and I encourage my AP literature friends to do this, in every prompt for FRQ1 and FRQ2, implicitly being asked in those prompts are 2 questions. What is the authorial intent, and how does the author construct meaning? If students can correctly read the poem or the short prose passage, the short story, if they can accurately ascertain its meaning and get at the heart of these 2 questions, they're going to come out of the gate pretty blazing, especially with the thesis point. They're absolutely going to get it. And then it just comes down to the nuanced things that I teach in my Nuance Academy and my Word Study Academy that will enable them out of the gate to show their reader that, hey, this is a kid that is going for the sophistication, the pizzazz, the flair point. So what is the authorial intent, and how does the author construct meaning? So I've already alluded to this. We're going to invert the thesis, and I'll unpack what I mean by that in just a second. But just to front load it, the first 3 sentences of the introductory paragraph are going to be context and background around this first question. What is the authorial intent? So that gets addressed in 3 sentences. And then how does the author construct meaning? This is going to be the thesis statement. So we're going to end with this. It's going to be the 4th sentence. So all introductory paragraphs are 4 sentences long. And we'll see students use their terms and devices to answer this question. And I have 6 exemplars and models to show you how to do this using both the Espada and the Baca poem. So when we declare, which we're not going to do, you begin with the thesis. So I just made a writing workshop for a synthesis paper that looked at the essential question, does SpongeBob SquarePants have any pedagogical value? So with an essential question, the student can either begin by directly answering that essential question or they end with it. So that's just kind of the paradigm here. You begin or you end, add the context and background without paraphrasing or getting plot summative. You don't want them to read like a Cliff Note summation. You don't want to be quoting. You don't want to regurgitate the prompt. I want to see a fair amount of tier 2 vocabulary in that. And I'll unpack that in the next slide. We also want to look for supple, fluent sentence constructs. And as I've already said, it's going to be exactly 4 sentences. So let's really focus on the inverted, because that's what we're going to be doing since we're performing literary analysis. So we're going to end with the thesis. How does the author construct meaning? Context and background, first 3 sentences. What is the authorial intent? So let me unpack what I mean by tier 2 level vocabulary. What I mean by that is just your average run-of-the-mill SAT level word. It's an academic paper, so vocab should be relatively elevated without the kids sounding contrived, pretentious, like goons. They got to stay in their wheelhouse. But I'm a big believer that for the sophistication point, students need to bust out a little colloquial and vernacular and teeter-totter balance that with the academic. So I'll show you how my students do that. Sentence constructs. Many of you are aware of the fact that I'm a big believer in what Strunk and White espouse in their seminal text called Write It Right, that there's 12 different ways to construct a single sentence. You'll see my students manipulate their syntax in the hopes of achieving voice, rhythm, and flow, and they'll break the pattern that struggling and emerging writers typically do, which is overuse independent clauses or the short, simple declarative sentence to break that droning rhythm that goes da-da, 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 da-da. So we've read papers for years and years and years in our career, and we've heard, that rhythm, that cadence in papers. So by really teaching your students how to manipulate those 12 sentence constructs, and have them hone in and focus on that and be deliberate through like their grammar, their punctuation, their syntax, all those manipulations can yield nice voice rhythm and flow. And then as always, it's going to be 4 sentences long. So let's see how this plays out. We'll start with Jorge, the church janitor finally quits by Martina Espada. And a student might do this. So it's, excuse me, it's 3 plus 1, 3 sentences. What is the authorial intent? Some teachers prefer the question, what is the universal theme or the universal truth? It does not matter how you cloak that language. The last sentence is going to be the construction of meaning. So let's see how this works here. Even churches are not immune to systemic racism. So that's kind of the aha of the poem, right? The grand irony that the setting is in a church and the congregation is being extremely racist and prejudiced towards Jorge. So begin with the exigence. Even churches are not immune to systemic racism. Preaching the teaching of the prophets and saints, one would expect such places to accept all individuals with open arms. The irony, however, is that these institutions have been breeding grounds for much of our nation's unchecked racism. So we're 3 sentences in. Look how the student uses terms and devices in the last sentence to drop the thesis. Martina Espada explores this dynamic through the characterization of his narrator and through elements that simultaneously objectify and personify the mop and Jorge. So I tell my students, end with the most salient terms and or devices. So this student is making the assertion that characterization, personification, and objectification are the three most important, and you're basically front loading your line of reasoning. You're dropping the seeds or laying down the rope for the line of reasoning. So it stands to reason, therefore, that these three things will be discussed in the body paragraphs plus the other bit parts of the poem, because we're going to do a thorough analysis. So as you can see here, 3 plus 1 every single time. You can see that the vocab is up, but it's within the kid's wheelhouse. The sentence structures are very good. I like this right here. The irony, comma, however, comma, right? And off you go. So a little stop and go. Some parentheticals, some adjective clauses, all sorts of dynamic sentence constructs to achieve the voice, the rhythm, the flow, right? And I like expressions like this: breeding grounds, unchecked racism. So some colloquial, some vernacular with the academic is what I think is needed to get the sophistication point. Perfect punctuation, I think that's really important as well. Here's another one that's going to follow the 3 plus 1 paradigm. The bottom line is this: racism is so pervasive in our country that one even finds it present in places that are supposed to be embracing and inviting of all. So starts pretty much the same way as the other. The idea that this has a racial element, a racial component to it, is vital to the understanding of the piece in terms of the authorial intent. Look at the sentence construct here. But, comma, rather ironically, comma, churches tend to house some of the most sanctimonious people of all. While on one hand, these institutions preach the ideals of inclusion and acceptance, on the other hand, the paradigm of the old hegemony still unfolds to this day. So that's 3 sentences of authorial intent. Hit me with the construction of meaning. Martin Espada illustrates this hypocrisy through his syntactical manipulation and the objectification of his narrator. So this person went irony, paradox, hypocrisy. That's all going to be tied into as one. And then the syntax and the objectification. So I tell my students, don't do a literary terms dumping ground. Cap it at 3. So this is a loaded poem. There's a lot that needs to be discussed in it. So these are all faring pretty well out of the gate. So far, so good. And I think especially for AP audience, an AP reader would read this and say, wow, this kid is flying. So good vocab, paradigm, hegemony, sanctimonious. Right, but it also has a little bit of that colloquial and vernacular in there as well to situate it. Look at the third sentence here in terms of the complexity, the rhythm, the flow. Couple that with the first sentence. So it definitely has a nice sequence, a nice chronology through it that is complex, right? It has some simple sentences and some complex sentences, and that's what's needed to wield a good start. So here's number 3 for Jorge the church janitor finally quits. I'm going to begin and end the same way. 3, context and background in terms of the authorial intent. 1, construction of meaning. One would expect that there not be racial chasms in sacred places. So all 3 students began pretty much in the same place, right? The exigence, the universal theme, the universal truth of the poem. Why did Espada write this? What was his purpose? However, many of our nation's churches have been witness to so much latent racism and prejudice over the years. The harsh irony is that these places preach the tenets of inclusion and acceptance, yet unwittingly perpetrate some of the worst forms of hatred. Last sentence, terms devices. Martin Espada illustrates these points through his narrator and figurative language. So not as dynamic as the previous 2, but it gets the job done, right? So it definitely is using the template and following that same 3 plus 1 tightrope in terms of getting it anchored. The vocab is nice. I like things like chasm. That's a good word. Latent is so perpetuate, unwittingly, tenants. So, but again, it's in the kids' wheelhouse. Often when I focus on vocab, I have students misuse words, invent words. They sound contrived, they sound pretentious, they sound like they're stretching too far. So I tell my kids, if you don't own that word, don't use it. And for all three samples so far, the kids own the words, and they're able to teeter-totter balance a little colloquial and vernacular in there to have that hipsterism that I like to see. Kind of like you're in a sophisticated coffee house being a hipster. I kind of like that voice in student writing. I think that's a good way to get the sophistication going. So let's take a look at Who Understands Me But Me by Jimmy Santiago Baca. New poem, exact same approach, 3+1. Ostensibly, prisons are erected to be institutions that rehabilitate deviant individuals. They operate under the assumption that if one's rights and liberties are stripped from them, once they are returned, the individual will be reformed. But little does one expect for an inmate to experience a transcendental spiritual experience while being in solitary confinement. And again, universal truth, universal theme, authorial intent, 3 sentences, 1 sentence construction of meaning to get the thesis. Santiago Baca details this journey through a series of dichotomies and syntactical maneuvers. So drop the salient terms and devices. New student, exact same approach. Prisons are constructed to rid the individual of their freedom, dignity, hope, and sense of self. To correct deviant behavior, the system must first vanquish all traces of the self. This is why the prison paradigm institutes such draconian measurements like solitary confinement. That's 3+1. The irony is, however, as Santiago Baca notes, that sometimes depriving one of their freedoms is all the freedom they need to find the truest forms of self-freedom. Look at the complexity of that last sentence. Flowy, supple, very nice, right? Very dynamic thesis statement. You couple it with the variety up top in the other sentence constructs, the tier 2, and a little bit of colloquial and vernacular. Love this. Draconian measurements, paradigm institutes, right? So very nice language without overdoing it. And here's one last one. The prison system creates a me versus them scenario in that it is the system's job to squelch the individual. This is why prisons and jails embrace a deprivation model. Ultimately, if the system has done its job properly, the individual gets so decimated and pummeled that it gets restored to a model citizen. Santiago Baca shows the ironies inherent in this paradigm through a series of dichotomous tugs and pulls. I love that, dichotomous tugs and pulls. That blend of the academic, the vernacular, the colloquial. This is what's needed for sophistication, I contend, right? I really think that needs to be done. In my YouTube channel, you have videos where I teach students and teachers how to write like this through my Nuance Academy. It's a staple of my National Writing Project course, the Teach It Right 5-week Mastermind. We spend so much time in my classroom, and the teachers that take my course also do the same, really developing this blend of that teeter-totter balance. It needs to be taught and it needs to be modeled extensively in order for kids to pull this off. And it needs to be coupled with a very strong word study academy as well. So intensive vocab instruction, which is something that I do in my Gen Ed classes, AP Lang and AP Lit, even in my college courses. It's a fundamental staple. So, all right, we move on to the rest of the essay. We have a solid foundation with our inverted theses. The next question is, so how do I tackle the body paragraphs? And for those of you that are familiar with my work, I hope this is refreshing, and I hope you say, holy cow, this guy is redundant. It never changes. It's true, you proceed syllogistically. And I love seeing my students slump in their seat as I'm Bob Rossing my instruction. So I always begin school the day after Labor Day. And usually around Thanksgiving time, especially in my AP classes, students begin to slump in their seat and roll their eyes and moan, and they're just like, oh my God, shut up with the modeling and all the exemplars. We don't need this anymore. And that's the beauty. That's when you know you've earned your paycheck, when you've created independent writers who can write cogent lines of reasoning with sophistication. You've definitely earned your paycheck. So I don't Bob Ross the whole school year. I just do it until kids can go independent, and then we kick the scaffolds down and remove the training wheels, and you got yourself some independent writers. So I know when I push into classrooms with consulting that sometimes, even at the senior level, teacher will unroll an essay and the kids look at that white piece of paper or their blank screens like they've never written an essay before in their lives. And with templates, that should not be happening. Students should intuitively, instinctually know what to do. And that's the glory of my templates. You go syllogistically every body paragraph, no matter the expository mode. If you're going rhetorical analysis, literary analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, research, it's always a syllogism. So let's just revisit this real quick. For teachers that are new to me or students that are new to me, you can do deeper dives in some of the videos that I have in my YouTube channel. I'm just going to do a cursory overview of this for now, but it should be enough for you to understand where we're going. So the syllogistic method is rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. It comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, word wrangling, wordsmithing, basically how to argue like a modern day lawyer in for a contemporary context. And you may be familiar with some works from this tradition, like Plato's Republic, where the philosophers would throw out juicy, pithy questions like, what is justice, right? That's the whole crux of Plato's Republic. And the great philosophers would step to the mic and they would drop their definition. And the other students and teachers would gather around and find all the bullet holes in that particular definition of justice. And a new philosopher would come to the mic, drop his definition, and so on and so forth. Aristotle was interested in something called cogency. We call it line of reasoning, right? When our students write, we want them to have like a mathematical, computative, clear line of reasoning. And Aristotle one day had a eureka moment and he said, aha, I got to teach my students to think syllogistically. And what he meant by that was kind of like a mathematical formula of logic, where you proceed from one premise to a second premise to a conclusion, kind of like basic math, addition and subtraction. So if I were to say, premise one, arsenic is deadly. Premise two, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. We'd all nod our heads and say, Christian, that's very cogent. That's a good line of reasoning. So that really works. That makes sense. So oftentimes what our students do, though, and I'm going to do a writing workshop on this in the coming weeks, especially looking at AP Lang and AP Lit papers. Most of our students only present a second premise, and that's why their writing reads like a Cliff Note summation or something that's really plot summative or regurgitative of the text that they're supposed to be analyzing. We have to keep in mind it's literary analysis, not plot analysis. So I really drill that with my students. So for the purposes of constructing literary analysis, let's meld the syllogistic constructor read like this. The first premise is going to be an argument containing terms and devices. On FRQ1 for the AP Lang exam, the directions state 3 times, your argument must be central. And I carp on my students about this, even my lit students. You're arguing. It's an expository mode, literary analysis is, and all expository writing is an active argument. So I want 3 sentences to set up that argument, and I'll model that for you a couple of times. The second premise is going to be the textual support. And here is a teeter-totter balance between quoting and paraphrasing. You don't want to do one so much more at the expense of the other. If you have that incongruency, it's going to be hard to get the sophistication point. Really feel that that needs to be balanced out. And then the conclusion of the syllogism, not the conclusion paragraph of the essay, but the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, houses the textual analysis. And this is where you have links, promise, echo come full circle. So you echo the thesis, echo the prompt, and you shake hands back with that first premise. I always tell my students that the first premise is a promise. You got to go full circle back to it. So really smart students ask good questions, and they say, all right, Mr. Kuhn, you got something up your sleeve here, because since we're using templates and an introductory paragraph is 4 sentences, you must have a magic number of sentences as far as a syllogistic body paragraph. How many sentences should I write? And I don't want to be prescriptive or formulaic, but those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence baggers that students write just don't have enough analysis and support to really substantiate an argument. They don't go anywhere, right? So I find a 10 to 12 sentence body paragraph is really sufficient. So hard cap at 12, shoot for 10 sentences. That tends to have enough support and analysis in it. So, all right, I want to show you something in terms of guaranteeing a clear line of reasoning. And I did this exercise in my hip hop and rap video where we looked at Tupac's poem, A Rose That Grew from Concrete, and Kanye West's poem, Divorce. So I showed you this, and it's a real good concrete way to guarantee and ensure that the student has a cogent line of reasoning from start to finish. So, as I alluded to already, the first premise is going to be 3 sentences long. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One, I want the kid to argue. And 2, I want to break the pattern of 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph syntax, right? You can't do that and get the sophistication point. And you're going to run out of time, and you're going to have these little itty bitty paragraphs that are weak. I want students to be able to read the totality of the poem, how the pieces make the whole of the poem. So link terms and devices together, have them working in unison with each other. So the one question that students ask, and again, it's a great question, is where do I start my first body paragraph? And you'll see my students transition with things like this. Right from the onset, Espada creates. So start where Espada starts. Start where the author starts. And have a chronology, have a sequence. Indicate to your reader that you are supremely organized and computative, kind of mathematic in terms of your execution. And then just proceed methodically through the piece and cross weave when necessary. So what I have here are my promises, my balls of yarn here. All right. And I literally put the student's paper up on the board, and I have balls of yarn in my room, and we draw the line of reasoning. And I'll illustrate what I mean by this. So the first sentence reads this. Right from the onset, Espada creates a stark dichotomy between his Hispanic narrator and the congregation hosting the church function. All right, so the fourth sentence begins the second premise. Since we're talking the yellow yarn here about the dichotomy needs to come first in terms of textual support. Let's see what ties with the dichotomy. Playing upon time-worn racial cliches, he euphemistically critiques the irony of the situation. So the red yarn needs to come second. We're going to talk about the cliches and the euphemisms and have to have quotes and paraphrases that are germane to the euphemism and the cliche. And the yellow yarn will have to have quotes and paraphrases associated with the dichotomy. That's how you keep line of reasoning intact. Even the syntactical arrangements highlight the racial tension while further accentuating the latent hypocrisy. So syntax is going to be associated with the blue. So we should proceed yellow, red, blue. So dichotomy, cliche, euphemism, syntax, in that order. All the quotes and paraphrases need to be germane to those colors. And on my board, we literally just tape the yellow to the yellow, the red to the red, the blue to the blue to make sure that the line of reasoning is intact. We do this during writing workshops and kind of do gallery walks. So I have a whole bunch of yarn in my classroom. We just tape it right on the essay and make sure that the line of reasoning is intact. And it really solidifies how to do this once students have run through this exercise a few times. So here's the whole body paragraph from start to finish. So let's take a look at the first premise again. It's going to be 3 sentences, and then we'll lay our yarn down. Right from the onset, Espada creates the stark dichotomy between his Hispanic narrator and the congregation hosting the church's function. Playing upon time-worn racial cliches, he euphemistically critiques the irony of the situation. Even the syntactical arrangements highlight the racial tension while further accentuating the latent hypocrisy. So, fourth sentence begins the second premise. We talked about dichotomy first. So, I think, let me go back here. That was the yellow yarn. So, we need to connect the yellow with the yellow. We should have a quote and a paraphrase here dealing with the dichotomy. So, let's see what we have. Immediately, the racial divide is brought to the forefront because no one asks where Jorge is from. He must be from the country of janitors. He's always mopped this floor. All right, so we're talking about the racial divide. We're talking about dichotomy. Yellow with yellow. We quoted, we have to analyze it and get to the heart of the dichotomy. It is clear from the beginning that none of the church attendees have an interest in helping Jorge to feel welcome. Even polite social decencies like asking where someone is from elude their thought. Espada amplifies this tension by suggesting that Jorge must be from the country of janitors. So let's go back here. We were talking about cliches and euphemisms, so we have the red yarn. That came second, so red's going to come down here. So, country of janitors, we quoted that. Clearly, this is tongue-in-cheek because if one is to pull down a world map, such a place does not exist. The narrator is playing upon the racist sentiment that all janitors come from Mexico, clearly a gross oversimplification and generalization that is hurtful and damning. So this red would be correlated to this red. So the quotes and the paraphrases are germane. We also needed to bring in the syntax, which was going to be the blue. So we got to get to there. All right. Another key feature in the opening stanza are the frequent comma splices. Do you see that? So now we're into syntax. And it continues. Espada does this to add to the irony of the situation. While Jorge is perceived as being just a simple migrant janitor there to accommodate the parishioners, he gently mocks them with his poor punctuation. When we tie this syntactical twist to the fact that the Spanish music of his name is lost when the guests complain about toilet paper, the ignorance of the attendees becomes that much more magnified, right? So you got to teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing. And notice I bracket as needed. Another thing to help kids embed their quotes, I have a template called the 5-word rule. If the student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote small, it should sound conversational. So a minimum of 5 words. Not only can they not properly pronounce Jorge's name and honor him in a dignified manner, but they deliberately exclude him for being other. While the party is going on, Jorge is simply seen as an object, a mop that will push on without him once he quits, sniffing along the floor like a crazy squid with stringy gray tentacles. Now we're at the conclusion, right? Promise, link, echo. Just takes a couple of sentences. The actions of the churchgoers go against the fundamental principles of every world religion, yet they are blind to their ways. So do you hear that? We started with religion up top in all the theses that we looked at. So you got to link it back. You got to go back to the thesis. This is the ugly face of how racism manifests itself. It's just unfortunate that it finds itself rearing its head in what are supposed to be holy places. Now, this one goes over 12 sentences, and we might ask ourselves, what could be, cut? Down here, it gets into the objectification and the personification of Jorge and the mop. I would hold that quote until the next body paragraph because the personification and objectification are huge and it really needs to be thoroughly analyzed. So I would tell this student, get that out of there and hold off, front load your first premise with personification and objectification because you did not talk about it in this first premise and you just transition from your terms and your devices. So hold off on that until you get down into the second body paragraph. All right, so the next question is this. How do I tackle the body paragraphs for who understands me but me? You're going to proceed syllogistically, the exact same thing. So first premise, argument containing terms and devices, 3 sentences long, teeter-totter balance the quoting and paraphrasing, and then link, promise, echo in the end, 10 to 12 sentences. Focus on that tier 2, focus on the sentence constructs, Tier 2, colloquial, vernacular, same old stuff as we were talking about in the for the introductions. So this student's going to start the exact same way. So this is real training wheel, early academic year kind of transition. Ultimately, I want kids to move away from this, but it works. So right from the onset, Santiago Baca creates the dichotomy between the prison system and the inmate. So we could do the same thing, place a blue yarn, ball of yarn here. So we got to talk about dichotomy first. Through a long litany of deprivations, so the litany might be red, the narrator ironically suggests that much more is being gained than what is being taken away. The syntactical features in the first stanza further highlight this paradoxical exchange. So you're arguing with terms and devices. This takes a ton of practice. Kids aren't used to this because most students, when they come to me, are so entrenched in writing plot synopsis that they're not used to arguing with literary features. So it takes a lot of practice. And in my YouTube channel, I have some practice exercises where we use Oscar-nominated short films to practice the first premise and the writing of the introductions. So same template here, new poem, same concept. Second premise begins the 4th sentence. We were talking about dichotomy, talk about dichotomy. Immediately, the they prison system begins the work of character reformation by stripping the narrator of his dignity and rights to basic life. They turn the water off, so I live without water. They build walls higher, so I live without treetops. They paint the windows black, so I live without sunshine. Right? So we got a quote here. We got to analyze this, get to the dichotomy. We were talking about irony. We were talking about litany. So let's connect this all. A basic need for survival is food, water, and air. It is clear that the system is only going to provide the narrator with the bare minimum requirements to sustain his life under the most meager of conditions. They is doing to the I, right? So we're talking about dichotomy, so we got to break that down. The entire first stanza is a long grocery list. So instead of saying litany again, just say it differently. A long grocery list of deprivations and subtractions meant to pummel the prisoner into a submission that breaks his soul and renders him teachable to the ways of reform. But what is unique about this is the narrator's sense of acceptance. So we go on to the next slide. He tells us that they give me pain, so I live with pain. They give me hate, so I live with my hate. So again, just keep on teeter-totter balancing the quoting and the paraphrasing. But be germane, right? Connect it to those yarns. In a cause and effect relationship, the way he internalizes these punishments is almost Christ-like in nature, a grand turning of the other cheek. And that's dangerous there because there's no allusion to Christ. This kid's just tying this in here. Little might be too much, I agree. What is also interesting about the first stanza is that syntactically it is one long run-on sentence. Why are we talking about this? Because it was the third thing we mentioned in our first premise. So it's a pecking order. Go right in order. Be chronological, be sequential, be cogent. Comma splice after comma splice, conditions just keep on getting worse. Santiago Baca constructed the poem in this manner to highlight the irony. The narrator should not be asking, who understands me when I say this is beautiful? So we're at the conclusion here. Personal freedom is not contingent upon the external world. It is a matter of personal perspective. What is beautiful about this transformation is that the narrator is given a bountiful abundance of self-love through the system of deprivation. This is the magical irony that has Santiago Baca smiling throughout the poem. So in both syllogisms, you see, this is hardcore literary analysis right here. There ain't no plot summation in this at all, which is what we want. The task, right? The demand of the assignment is to perform literary analysis. So that's why I like that 3-sentence first premise, argue with the terms. Connect the pieces of yarn as you go to keep the line of reasoning intact. You do the Nuance Academy, the Word Study Academy, and bingo, your kids are going to crush this. So even your Gen Ed kids can write like this to some approximation. So what do I do next? I only showed you the first two body paragraphs. You bust out another syllogism, change up the lit terms, what's left, and just proceed syllogistically. New quotes, new lit terms, hammer it out, throw a conclusion paragraph on the end. So hopefully you found this to be useful and can use it between September 15th and October 15th of this academic year. Know that something special has happened in my world. So I'm working with the National Writing Project these days. They are running and hosting my Teach It Right 5-week mastermind, which is fantastic news for a number of reasons. One, the price is greatly reduced because the National Writing Project has less overhead than I do as a solo operation. So the other thing is, in terms of good news, they are able to offer 10 badge hours of professional development. So for those of you in need of some good professional development, for 5 hours, you can get 10 hours. Here's the kicker. We meet Sunday nights, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for 5 consecutive weeks, but you get a 10-hour badge. There's just a modicum, a tad bit of preparation for each class. Takes 10 to 15 minutes, and then you deep dive as much as you want. You can do as much as you want with regards to my teaching, and we run you through that Word Study Academy, that Nuance Academy, all the Strunk and White stuff, my alternative grading methods, my Plato's Plato discussion modality. And it's a very full, action-packed 5 weeks. So the other thing too is I'm recording this on Labor Day 2022. Tomorrow I start my 20th year in the classroom. And now that school's in session, I will be having a regular cadence with Perfection Learning of webinars. Looks like we're going to be doing once a month going forward once the academic year kicks off. So I'll keep the Facebook groups posted of that, as well as my Instagram and email list. And then November is poking around the corner here, and Tim Freitas, Brandon Abden, and I, my good buddies, are going to be presenting at the NCTE conference in Anaheim, California this coming November. So if you would like these slides or any information about the irons I have in the fire, you can email me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. For more information about the Teach It Right 5-week mastermind, I have a link on my webpage, www.teachinghowtowrite.com, or you can go directly to the NWP page, which is www.nwp.org. It's probably easier to go to my page. I have a direct link to it. NWP has a lot of other things on their page, which is hard to navigate. So I have a direct link. So www.teachingHowToWrite.com. So hopefully you found this to be useful and can use it with your students. For now, happy teaching, happy writing.